A new emperor and an emperor renewed. Strange clouds filled the sky, and the sun hung heavy and huge and red behind them, and the ocean was black as the golden galleys swept homeward before their battered flagship, the son of the Pyre, which moved slowly with dead slaves at her oars and her tattered sails limp at their masts, and smoke-begrimed men on her decks, and a new emperor upon her war-wrecked bridge. The new emperor was the only jubilant man in the fleet, and he was jubilant indeed. It was his banner now, not Elric's, which took pride of place on the flagmast, for he had lost no time in proclaiming Elric slain, and himself ruler of Melnibone. To Urkun, the peculiar sky was an omen of change, of a return to the old ways and the old power of the Dragon Isle. When he issued orders, his voice was a veritable croon of pleasure, and Admiral Margum Colum, who had ever been wary of Elric, but who now had to obey Urkun's orders, wondered if perhaps it would not have been preferable to have dealt with Urkun in the manner in which he suspected Urkun had dealt with Elric. Divim Tvar leaned on the rail of his own ship, to Harley's particular satisfaction, and he also paid attention to the sky, though he saw omens of doom, for he mourned for Elric and considered how he might take vengeance on Prince Urkun, should it emerge that Urkun had murdered his cousin for possession of the Ruby Throne. Melnibone appeared on the horizon, a brooding silhouette of crags, a dark monster squatting in the sea, calling her back to the heated pleasures of her womb, the dreaming city of Imrryr. The great cliffs loomed, and the central gate to the sea maze opened. Water slapped and gasped at the golden prows, as the golden prows disturbed it, and the golden ships were swallowed into the murky dankness of the tunnels, where bits of wreckage still floated from the previous night's encounter, where white, bloated corpses could still be seen when the brandlight touched them. The prows nosed arrogantly through the remains of their prey, but there was no joy above the golden battle barges, for they brought news of their old emperor's death in battle. Urkun had told them what had happened. Next night, and for 7 nights, and all the wild dance of Melnibone would fill the streets. Potions and petty spells would ensure that no one slept, for sleep was forbidden to any Melnibonean, old or young, while a dead emperor was mourned. Naked, the dragon princes would prowl the city, taking any young woman they found and filling her, for it was traditional that if an emperor died, then the nobles of Melnibone must create as many children of aristocratic blood as was possible. Music slaves would howl from the top of every tower. Other slaves would be slain and some eaten. It was a dreadful dance, the dance of misery, and it took as many lives as it created. A tower would be pulled down and a new one erected during those 7 days, and the tower would be called for Elric VIII, the albino emperor, lain upon the sea, defending Melnibone against the Southland pirates. Slain upon the sea and his body taken by the waves. That was not a good portent, for it meant that Elric had gone to serve Pyre, the tentacled whisperer of impossible secrets. The Chaos Lords who commanded the Chaos Fleet, dead ships, dead sailors, forever in his thrall. And it was not fitting that such a fate should befall one of the royal line of Melnibone. But the mourning would be long, thought Divim Tvar. He had loved Elric, for all that he had sometimes disapproved of his methods of ruling the Dragon Isle. Secretly he would go to the Dragon Caves that night and spend the period of mourning with the sleeping dragons who, now that Elric was dead, were all he had left to love. And Divim Tvar then thought of Cimmeril, awaiting Elric's return. The ships began to emerge into the half-light of the evening. Torches and braziers already burned on the quays of Imrryr, which were deserted save for a small group of figures who stood around a chariot which had been driven out to the end of the central mole. A cold wind blew. Diventvar knew that it was the Princess Cymril who waited with her guards for the fleet. Though the flagship was the last to pass through the maze, the rest of the ships had to wait until it could be towed into position and dock first. If this had not been the required tradition, Diventvar would have left his ship and gone to speak to Cymril, escort her from the quay and tell her what he knew of the circumstances of Elric's death. But it was impossible. Even before, to Harley's particular satisfaction, had dropped anchor, the main gangplank of the Son of the Pyre had been lowered and the Emperor Urkun, all swaggering pride, had stepped down it, his arms raised in triumphant salute to his sister, who could be seen, even now, searching the decks of the ships for a sign of her beloved albino. Suddenly, Cymril knew that Elric was dead, and she suspected that Urkun had in some way been responsible for Elric's death. Either Urkun had allowed Elric to be borne down by a group of Southland reavers, or else he had managed to slay Elric himself. She knew her brother, and she recognised his expression. He was pleased with himself, as he always had been when successful in some form of treachery or another. Anger flashed in her tear-filled eyes, and she threw back her head and shouted at the shifting, ominous sky, "Urkun has destroyed him!" Her guards were startled. The captain spoke solicitously. "Madam, he is dead, and that brother slew him. Take Prince Urkun, Captain. Kill Prince Urkun, Captain." Unhappily, the captain put his right hand on the hilt of his sword. A young warrior, more impetuous, drew his blade, murmuring, "I will slay him, princess, if that is your desire." The young warrior loved Cymril with considerable and unthinking intensity. The captain offered the warrior a cautionary glance, but the warrior was blind to it. Now 2 others slid swords from scabbards as Urkun, a red cloak wound about him, his dragon crest catching the light from the brands guttering in the wind, stalked forward and cried, "Urkun is emperor now." "No!" shrieked Urkun's sister. "Elric, where are you?" Serving his new master, Pyre of Chaos. His dead hands pull at the sweep of a chaos ship, sister. His dead eyes see nothing at all. His dead ears hear only the crack of Pyre's whips, and his dead flesh cringes, feeling naught but that unearthly scourge. Elric sank in his armour to the bottom of the sea. "Murderer! Traitor!" Cymril began to sob. The captain, who was a practical man, said to his warriors in a low voice, "Sheathe your weapons and salute your new emperor." Only the young guardsman who loved Cymril disobeyed. "But he slew the emperor. My lady Cymril said so." "What of it? He is emperor now. Kneel, or you'll be dead within the minute." The young warrior gave a wild shout and leapt towards Urkun, who stepped back, trying to free his arms from the folds of his cloak. He had not expected this. But it was the captain who leapt forward, his own sword drawn, and hacked down the youngster so that he gasped, half-turned, and then fell at Urkun's feet. The demonstration of the captain's was confirmation of his real power, and Urkun almost smirked with satisfaction as he looked down at the corpse. The captain fell to one knee, the bloody sword still in his hand. "My emperor," he said. "You show a proper loyalty, Captain." "My loyalty is to the ruby throne." "Quite so." Cymril shook with grief and rage, but her rage was impotent. She knew now that she had no friends. Leering, the Emperor Urkun presented himself before her. He reached out his hand and caressed her neck, her cheek, her mouth. He let his hand fall so that it grazed her breast. "Sister," he said, "thou art mine entirely now." And Cymril was the second to fall at his feet, for she had fainted. "Pick her up," Erkun said to the guard. "Take her back to her own tower, and there be sure she remains. 2 guards will be with her at all times, and even her most private moments they must observe her, for she may plan treachery against the Ruby Throne." The captain bowed and signed to his men to obey the Emperor. "Aye, my lord, it shall be done." Erkun looked back at the corpse of the young warrior. "And feed that to the slaves tonight, so that he can continue serving her." He smiled. The captain smiled too, appreciating the joke. He felt it was good to have a proper emperor in Melnibone again, an emperor who knew how to behave, who knew how to treat his enemies, and who accepted unswerving loyalty as his right. The captain fancied that fine martial times lay ahead for Melnibone. The golden battle barges and the warriors of Imrryr could go a-spoiling again, and instill in the barbarians of the young kingdoms a sweet and satisfactory sense of fear. Already in his mind the captain helped himself to the treasures of Lormir, Argimiliar, and Picarade, of Ilmiora and Jadmar. He might even be made governor, say, of the Isle of the Purple Towns. What luxuries of torment would he bring to those upstart sea lords, particularly Count Smjorgen Baldhead, who was even now beginning to try to make the isle a rival to Melnibone as a trading port. As he escorted the limp body of the Princess Cymmeril back to her tower, the captain looked on that body and felt the swellings of lust within him. Erkun would reward his loyalty, there would be no doubt of that. Despite the cold winds, the captain began to sweat in his anticipation. He himself would guard the Princess Cymmeril. He would relish it. Marching at the head of his army, Erkun strutted for the tower of De Arputna, the Tower of Emperors, and the ruby throne within. He preferred to ignore the litter which had been brought for him, and to go on foot, so that he might savour every small moment of his triumph. He approached the tower, tall amongst its fellows at the very centre of Imrryr, as he might approach a beloved woman. He approached it with a sense of delicacy and without haste, for he knew that it was his. He looked about him. His army marched behind him. Margum Colum and Divim Tvar led the army. People lined the twisting streets and bowed low to him. Slaves prostrated themselves. Even the beasts of burden were made to kneel as he strode by. Erkun could almost taste the power as one might taste a luscious fruit. He drew deep breaths of the air. Even the air was his. All Imrryr was his. All Melnibone. Soon would all the world be his, and he would squander it all. How he would squander it! Such a grand terror would he bring back to the earth, such a munificence of fear. In ecstasy, almost blindly, did the Emperor Erkun enter the tower. He hesitated at the great doors of the throne room. He signed for the doors to be opened, and as they opened he deliberately took in the scene, tiny bit by tiny bit. The walls, the banners, the trophies, the galleries, all were his. The throne room was empty now, and soon he would fill it with colour and celebration, and true Melnibonean entertainments. It had been too long since blood had sweetened the air of this hall, and now he let his eyes linger upon the steps leading up to the ruby throne itself. But before he looked at the throne, he heard Divim Tvar gasp behind him, and his gaze went suddenly to the ruby throne, and his jaw slackened at what he saw. His eyes widened in incredulity. An illusion! An apparition, said Divim Tvar with some satisfaction. Heresy! Cried the Emperor Erkun, staggering forward, finger pointing at the robed and cowled figure which sat so still upon the ruby throne. Mine! Mine! The figure made no reply. Mine! Begone! The throne belongs to Erkun. Erkun is Emperor now. And what are you? Why would you thwart me thus? The cowl fell back and a bone-white face was revealed, surrounded by flowing milk-white hair. Crimson eyes looked coolly down at the shrieking, stumbling thing which came toward them. "You are dead, Elric. I know that you are dead." The apparition made no reply, but a thin smile touched the white lips. "You could not have survived. You drowned. You cannot come back. Pyre owns your soul." "There are others who rule in the sea," said the figure on the ruby throne. "Why did you slay me, cousin?" Urkun's guile had deserted him, making way for terror and confusion. "Because it is my right to rule. Because you were not strong enough, nor cruel enough, nor humorous enough." "Well, is this not a good joke, cousin?" "Begone! I shall not be ousted by a spectre. A dead emperor cannot rule Melnibone." "We shall see," said Elric, signing to Divim and his soldiers. Chapter 3. A Traditional Justice. "Now indeed shall I rule as you would have me rule, cousin." Elric watched as Divimtvar's soldiers surrounded the would-be usurper and seized his arms, relieving him of his weapons. Urkun panted like a captured wolf. He glared around him as if hoping to find support from the assembled warriors, but they stared back at him either neutrally or with open contempt. "And you, Prince Urkun, will be the first to benefit from this new rule of mine. Are you pleased?" Urkun lowered his head. He was trembling now. Elric laughed. "Speak up, cousin." "May Arioch and all the dukes of hell torment you for eternity," growled Urkun. He flung back his head, his wild eyes rolling, his lips curling. "Arioch, curse this feeble albino Arioch, destroy him, or see Melnibone fall." Elric continued to laugh. "Arioch does not hear you. Chaos is weak upon the earth now. It needs a greater sorcery than yours to bring the Chaos Lords back to aid you as they aided our ancestors. And now, Urkun, tell me, where is the Lady Cymmeril?" But Urkun had lapsed again into a sudden silence. "She is at her own tower, my emperor," said Margum Colum. "A creature of Urkun's took her there," said Divimtvar, the captain of Cymmeril's own guard. "He slew a warrior who tried to defend his mistress against Urkun. It could be that Princess Cymmeril is in danger, my lord." "Well then, go quickly to the tower, take a force of men, bring both Cymmeril and the captain of her guard to me." "And Urkun, my lord?" asked Divimtvar. "Let him remain there until his sister returns." Divimtvar bowed and selected a body of warriors, leaving the throne room. All noticed that Divimtvar's step was lighter and the expression less grim than when he had first approached the throne room at Prince Urkun's back. Urkun straightened his head and looked about the court. For a moment he seemed like a pathetic and bewildered child. All the lines of hate and anger had disappeared, and Elric felt sympathy for his cousin growing again within him. But this time Elric quelled the feeling. "Be grateful, cousin, that for a few hours you were totally powerful, and you enjoyed domination over all the folk of Melnibone." Urkun said in a small, puzzled voice, "How did you escape? You had no time for making a sorcery, no strength for it. You could barely move your own limbs, and your armour must have dragged you deep to the bottom of the sea so that you should have drowned. It's unfair, Elric, you should have drowned." Elric shrugged. "I have friends in the sea. They recognise my royal blood and my right to rule, even if you do not." Urkun tried to disguise his astonishment. Evidently his respect for Elric had increased, as had his hatred for the albino emperor. "Friends?" "Aye," said Elric through a thin grin. I thought too you had vowed not to use your powers of sorcery." "But you thought that was a vow which was unbefitting for a Melnibonean monarch to make, did you not?" "Well, I agree with you. You see, Urkun, you have won a victory after all." Urkun stared narrowly at Elric as if trying to divine a secret meaning behind Elric's words. "You will bring back the Chaos Lords?" "No sorcerer, however powerful, can summon the Chaos Lords, or for that matter the Lords of Law, if they do not wish to be summoned. That you know. You must know it, Urukun. Have you not yourself tried? And Ariok did not come, did he? Did he bring you the gift you sought? The gift of the 2 black swords?" "You know that." "I did not. I guessed. But now I know." Urukun tried to speak, but his voice would not form words, so angry was he. Instead, a strangled growl escaped his throat, and for a few moments he struggled in the grip of his guards. Divim Tvar returned with Imrryr. The girl was pale, but she was smiling. She ran into the throne room. "Elric!" "Imrryr, are you harmed?" Imrryr glanced at the crestfallen captain of her guard who had been brought with her. A look of disgust crossed her fine face, and she shook her head. "No, I am not harmed." The captain of Imrryr's guard was shaking with terror. He looked pleadingly at Urukun as if hoping that his fellow prisoner could help him, but Urukun continued to stare at the floor. "Have that one brought closer." Elric pointed at the captain of the guard. The man was dragged to the foot of the steps leading to the ruby throne. He moaned. "What a petty traitor you are," said Elric. "At least Urukun had the courage to attempt to slay me, and his ambitions were high. Your ambition was merely to become one of his pet curs. So you betrayed your mistress and slew one of your own men. What's your name?" The man had difficulty speaking, but at last he murmured, "It is Valharik, my name. What could I do? I serve the ruby throne, whoever sits upon it." "Oh, so the traitor claims that loyalty motivated him." "I think not." "It was, my lord, it was." The captain began to whine. He fell to his knees. "Slay me swiftly. Do not punish me more." Elric's impulse was to heed the man's request, but he looked at Urukun and then remembered the expression on Imrryr's face when she had looked at the guard. He knew that he must make a point now, whilst making an example of Captain Valharik. So he shook his head. "No, I will punish you more. Tonight you will die here according to the traditions of Melnibone, while my nobles feast to celebrate this new era of my rule." Valharik began to sob, and then he stopped himself, got slowly to his feet, a Melnibonean again. He bowed low and stepped backward, giving himself to the grip of his guards. "I must consider a way in which your fate may be shared with the one you wish to serve," Elric went on. "How did you slay the young warrior who sought to obey Imrryr?" "With my sword I cut him down. It was a clean stroke, but one." "And what became of the corpse?" "Prince Urukun told me to feed it to the Princess Imrryr's slaves." "I understand. Very well, Prince Urukun. You may join us in the feast tonight while Captain Valharik entertains us with his dying." Urukun's face was almost as pale as Elric's. "What do you mean?" "The little pieces of Captain Valharik's flesh which our Dr. Jest will carve from his limbs will be the meat on which you feast. You may give instructions as to how you wish the captain's flesh prepared. We should not expect you to eat it raw, cousin." Even Divim Tvar looked astonished at Elric's decision. Certainly it was in the spirit of Melnibone and a clever irony, improving on Prince Urukun's own idea, but it was unlike Elric, or at least it was unlike the Elric he had known up until a day earlier. As he heard his fate, Captain Valharik gave a great scream of terror and glared at Prince Urukun as if the would-be usurper were already tasting his flesh. Urukun tried to turn away, his shoulders shaking. "And that will be the beginning of it," said Elric. "The feast will start at midnight. Until that time, confine Urukun to his own tower." After Prince Urkun and Captain Valharic had been led away, Divim Tvar and Princess Imrryr came and stood beside Elric, who had sunk back in his own great throne and was staring bitterly into the middle distance. "That was a clever cruelty," Divim Tvar said. Imrryr said, "It is what they both deserve." "Aye," murmured Elric, "it is what my father would have done. It is what Urkun would have done had our positions been reversed. I but follow the traditions. I no longer pretend that I am my own man. Here I shall stay until I die, trapped upon the ruby throne, serving the ruby throne as Valharic claimed to serve it." "Could you not kill them both quickly?" Imrryr asked. "You know that I do not plead for my brother because he is my brother. I hate him most of all. But it might destroy you, Elric, to follow through with your plan." What if it does? Let me be destroyed. Let me merely become an unthinking extension of my ancestors, the puppet of ghosts and memories, dancing to strings which extend back through time for 10,000 years. "Perhaps if you slept," Divim Tvar suggested. "I shall not sleep, I feel, for many nights after this. But your brother is not going to die, Imrryr. After his punishment, after he has eaten the flesh of Captain Valharic, I intend to send him into exile. He will go alone into the young kingdoms, and he will not be allowed to take his grimoires with him. He must make his way as best he can in the lands of the barbarian. That is not too severe a punishment, I think." "It is too lenient," said Imrryr. "You would be best advised to slay him. Send soldiers now. Give him no time to consider counterplots." "I do not fear his counterplots." Elric rose wearily. "Now I should like it if you were both to leave me until an hour or so before the feasting begins. I must think." "I will return to my tower and prepare myself for tonight," said Imrryr. She kissed Elric lightly upon his pale forehead. He looked up, filled with love and tenderness for her. He reached out and touched her hair and her cheek. "Remember that I love you, Elric," she said. "I will see that you are safely escorted homeward," Divim Tvar said to her, "and you must choose a new commander of your guard. Can I assist you in that?" "I should be grateful, Divim Tvar." They left Elric still upon the ruby throne, still staring into space. The hand that he lifted from time to time to his pale head shook a little, and now the torment showed in his strange crimson eyes. Later, he rose up from the ruby throne and walked slowly, head bowed, to his own apartments, followed by his guards. He hesitated at the door which led onto the steps going up the library. Instinctively, he sought the consolation and forgetfulness of a certain kind of knowledge, but at that moment he suddenly hated his scrolls and his books. He blamed them for his ridiculous concerns regarding morality and justice. He blamed them for the feelings of guilt and despair which now filled him as a result of his decision to behave as a Melnibonean monarch was expected to behave. So he passed the door to the library and went on to his own apartments. But even his apartments displeased him now. They were austere. They were not furnished according to the luxurious tastes of all Melniboneans, save for his father, with their delight in lush mixtures of colour and bizarre design. He would have them changed as soon as possible. He would give himself up to those ghosts who ruled him. For some time he stalked from room to room, trying to push back that part of him which demanded to be merciful to Valharic and to Urkun. At very least to slay them and be done with it, or better, to send them both into exile. But it was impossible to reverse his decision now. At last he lowered himself to a couch which rested beside a window looking out over the whole of the city. The sky was still full of turbulent cloud, but now the moon shone through like a yellow eye of an unhealthy beast. It seemed to stare with a certain triumphant irony at him, as if relishing the defeat of his conscience. Elric sank his head into his arms. Later the servants came to tell him that the courtiers were assembling for the celebration feast. He allowed them to dress him in his yellow robes of state and to place the dragon crown upon his head, and then he returned to the throne room to be greeted by a mighty cheer, more wholehearted than any he had ever received before. He acknowledged the greeting and then seated himself in the ruby throne, looking out over the banqueting tables which now filled the hall. A table was brought and set before him, and 2 extra seats were brought, for Divimtvar and Imrryr would sit beside him. But Divimtvar and Imrryr were not yet here, and neither had the renegade Valharic been brought. And where was Urkun? They should even now be at the centre of the hall, Valharic in chains and Urkun seated beneath him. Dr. Jest was there, heating his brazier on which rested his cooking pans, testing and sharpening his knives. The hall was filled with excited talk as the court waited to be entertained. Already the food was being brought in, though no one might eat until the Emperor ate first. Elric signed to the commander of his own guard. "Has the Princess Imrryr or Lord Divimtvar arrived at the tower yet?" "No, my lord. Imrryr was rarely late, and Divimtvar never." Elric frowned. Perhaps they did not relish the entertainment. "And what of the prisoners?" "Well, they have been sent for, my lord." Dr. Chest looked up expectantly, his thin body tensed in anticipation. And then Elric heard a sound above the din of the conversation, a groaning sound which seemed to come from all around the tower. He bent his head and listened closely. Others were hearing it now. They stopped talking and also listened intently. Soon the whole hall was in silence, and the groaning increased. And then all at once the doors of the throne room burst open, and there was Divimtvar, gasping and bloody, his clothes slashed and his flesh gashed. And following him in came a mist, a swirling mist of dark purples and unpleasant blues, and it was this mist that groaned. Elric sprang from his throne and knocked the table aside. He leaped down the steps towards his friend. The groaning mist began to creep further into the throne room, as if reaching out for Divimtvar. Elric took his friend in his arms. "Divimtvar, what is this sorcery?" Divimtvar's face was full of horror, and his lips seemed frozen until at last he said, "It is Urkun's sorcery. He conjured the groaning mist to aid him in his escape. I tried to follow him from the city, but the mist engulfed me and I lost my senses. I went to the tower to bring him and his accessory here, but the sorcery had already been accomplished." "Imrryr, where is she?" "He took her, Elric. She is with him. Valharic is with him, and so are 100 warriors who remained secretly loyal to him." "Then we must pursue him. We shall soon capture him. You can do nothing against the groaning mist. It comes." And sure enough, the mist was beginning to surround them. Elric tried to disperse it by waving his arms, but then it had gathered thickly around him, and its melancholy groaning filled his ears. Its hideous colours blinded his eyes. He tried to rush through it, but it remained with him, and now he thought he heard words amongst the groans. "Elric is weak. Elric is foolish. Elric must die." "Stop this," he cried. He bumped into another body and fell to his knees. He began to crawl, desperately trying to peer through the mist. And now faces formed in the mist, frightful faces, more terrifying than any he had ever seen, even in his worst nightmares. "Imrryr," he cried, "Imrryr." And one of the faces became the face of Imrryr, a Imrryr who leered at him and mocked him, and whose face slowly aged until he saw a filthy crone and ultimately a skull on which the flesh rotted. He closed his eyes, but the image remained. "Imrryr," whispered the voices. "Oh, Imrryr." And Elric grew weaker as he became more desperate. He cried out for Divimtvar, but heard only a mocking echo of the name, as he had heard Imrryr's. He shut his lips, and he shut his eyes, and still crawling, tried to free himself from the groaning mist. But hours seemed to pass before the groans became whines, and the whines became faint strands of sound, and he tried to rise, opening his eyes to see the mist fading. But then his legs buckled, and he fell down against the first step which led to the ruby throne. And again he had ignored Cymryl's advice concerning her brother, and again she was in danger. Elric's last thought was a simple one. I am not fit to live.